Tonight, you'll be hearing 5 stories told by the descendants of Holocaust survivors, plus one by Matt. Obviously, these stories are not always easy to hear, and certainly for the people telling them, not always easy to tell. But it's so important to continue to tell them and make sure, it's so important to continue to tell them to make sure that these events are never forgotten, and so that we can hear exactly what happened from the people who lived through it and grew up with those who lived through it, not to let other people who have their own motives tell these stories. Additionally, coming together to listen to these stories strengthens our community and deepens our understanding of the Jewish experience. As we all know, public speaking is the favorite thing of very few people, and telling stories like this adds a layer of vulnerability on top of that. And really looking out at a bunch of people who have their nice faces on and are actively wishing them well makes a huge difference. All right, next up is Norman Berman. Norm lives in Brooklyn, Connecticut, and has been practicing law for the past 49 years. He also serves on the boards of a number of organizations, sang in a Yiddish choir, and enjoys a whole bunch of things I wish I was good at, like landscaping, gardening, and fixing things. Norm also combined a very personal history lesson with his brunch invitation. Here's what he said. I would want to have brunch with Baron Maurice de Hirsch. You guys have heard of him? I hadn't heard of him either. Entrepreneur, banker, railroad builder, and philanthropist. He created and funded the Jewish Agricultural Society, which through loans and education enabled thousands of Jewish immigrant Holocaust survivors, among them my parents and nearly 50 families in and around Danielson, Connecticut, to settle on poultry farms in America, create new lives, and establish independent livelihoods. The society also helped to settle immigrant survivors in Vineland, New Jersey. Is it Vineland or Vineland? Vineland? Vineland, New Jersey, the Catskills, LA, and Petaluma, California. Believing that Jews should be encouraged to settle in America, Canada, Argentina, and other parts of the world, he famously clashed with Theodore Herzl about whether Israel should be the only place for Jews to safely settle to escape persecution. He has been called Moses of the New World. Amazing, and it sounds like he helped so many families. Thank you for teaching us about him, although it sounds like a bunch of you know about him. Please welcome Norm Berman.
I was 6 years old in the kitchen in our farmhouse in Connecticut, and I was on the telephone negotiating the price of chicken feed with a grain dealer. My mother stood next to me speaking in Yiddish, telling me what I should tell the man on the telephone. And I told him, and then I would report back to her what the man had said to me. This was part of my role as a child, to interpret. My parents were different from the other kids' parents. The other kids' parents were confident, they were comfortable, they were very much at home in 1950s America. My parents were awkward, hesitant. They spoke with accents. Their English was not good. And they put me in a very elevated position, which started really with my birth in DP Camp Fehrenwald a few years after the liberation. My mother described the day she was in the hospital. I had been born, and there was wild celebration outside. It was not for me, but the word had just gotten out that the state of Israel had just been established. And so all the refugees in the camp were they were delighted. My birth was a big deal. My parents had just emerged from their respective nightmares. They had lost everything and almost everyone. And they found each other in DP Camp Fehrenwald They were introduced, I think it was a blind date, and they courted. My dad sang Russian love songs to my mother to calm her down. And they got married there, and I was part of the baby boom in 1948 in Camp Fehrenwald. My mother, Bluma Kammenmacher, had spent 2 years in the Vilna Ghetto. She then spent the remainder of the war in 3 different concentration camps. My father, Misha Berman, had been conscripted into the Russian army when they occupied his village, the Soviet army. And he returned to his home some months later to find that most of his family had been murdered. He was arrested. He was placed in the Dubno ghetto, from which he somehow escaped, and then spent the remainder of the war on the run, in hiding, in the forests of Europe. They encountered one another in that camp, and as I said, I was the product. And the importance of my birth was huge, and it was always driven home to me whenever my folks would talk about it, because they were at a very low point in their lives. Yes, they had come into the DP camp and they had survived, but I represented proof that there could be life after this catastrophe. And so there was a quality, a miraculous quality attached to my being born. So Hayes got us out of the camp and into a tenement in the Bronx. Misha and Bluma became Morris and Betty. And a few years later, the Jewish Agricultural Society settled us on a farm in Connecticut, a 60-acre poultry farm, 10,000 chickens, plenty to do. Although my parents had no clue about farming. They were, they were children when they got caught up in this horror. But they managed. I went off to the first grade. I expected all the children would be speaking Yiddish, because we spoke Yiddish, and no one told me that, that might not be the case once I went out there. No one did. But I was a quick study. I picked up English, and I came home to show it off and assume my responsibility as not only an interpreter, but an advisor, a counselor, a guidance person. I mean, I was, and not only did I interpret the language, but I interpreted America to my immigrant parents. I brought home everything that I was learning at school. And of course, they were very proud. I was also curious, and I liked to take things apart. And sometimes I was able to put them back together. But I learned how to fix things. And there was no shortage of things that needed fixing on the farm. So in addition to my being interpreter, I also became the fixer. And so it went until I left for college. I went to Boston University. I would get frantic phone calls from my mother. Norman, you have to come home. I said, what's the matter? The egg grater that weighs and sorts the eggs, it's making noise, it's breaking the eggs. The automatic feeder that distributes the grain to the chickens is jammed, and the chickens can't eat. And it made a noise like that. and they didn't know what to do. So fortunately, there was hourly bus service between Boston and Providence. And so I would hop on the next bus, come to Providence. My dad would pick me up in Providence, bring me home. I ate something, of course, and then set about the business of fixing whatever it was. And generally, I don't know if it was my skill or my good fortune, some combination perhaps, but I managed to fix whatever it was. And it was hard because we had no tools to speak of. There was a heavy pipe wrench and a small adjustable wrench, some screwdrivers, pliers, and a hammer. That was pretty much the array that I had to work with. And they were bent and they were rusty. But I pulled it off. And my mother was delighted. And she would tell everyone, she said, that Nochem, he can fix anything, anything. And I believed her. I thought I could. A few years later, it was summer, and she and I, my mother and I, are sitting in lawn chairs on the farm. And I had a tape recorder. And I had decided I wanted to know the details. I wanted to interview her. And we spoke in Yiddish still, because that was our comfortable at-home language. And we had some time. We had finished the morning chores, and it was that period of time when there was, so it was relaxed. And she spoke beautifully of her childhood in her little shtetl in what's now Lithuania. She talked about, it was called Tabrashuk, and she talked about the nature and the rivers and the animals and the flowers and a carefree, beautiful childhood. And then she talked about how, as a young teenager, she went to Vilna, the amazing Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, and how she loved it, and how the world, it just opened her eyes, and it held out such promise and such hope. She saw her future. She said, oh my God, I could do anything, I could be anything. She was on top of the world. And then she described in great detail the Soviet occupation, followed, of course, by the German occupation, and then being driven out of their apartments on very short notice. They were told to carry what they could and driven into what became the Vilna ghetto. And she continued. She spoke about the crowding and the hunger and the cold and the sickness and just what an awful experience it was, even in the early days, but later it just got worse and worse. They were surrounded by death, and it got worse when they went to the concentration camps. She was there at the very end when they liquidated the ghetto. They were put on a train, taken to the camps, forced labor, cold. But she was, throughout this time, she was with her sister, Sarah. She was with their mother, Vega, the three women together, through the ghetto, through the camps, and perhaps that helped them to survive because they had each other. And she talked about how there were times when one of us wanted to give up. We said, we cannot, too hungry, too weak, cannot do this anymore. And the other two would say, no, you have to. We're going to get through this together. So as soon as one flagged, the others provided support. And they made it through. And so we spoke, and I have the tapes, and this moved me. I felt so awful. I felt very just pained by hearing all of this. And what was also difficult was that my dad didn't talk about his experiences at all. And in some ways, it was as painful or maybe even more painful not to know. So I decided, because of all this, I was determined to spare them my teenage rebellion. I was going to be, they named me Nachum. That's comfort. Nachum. Became Norman, just like they became Betty and Morris, but at home I was always Nachum. And I felt that it was my obligation to make it up to them somehow, that I would make up for their loss, I would make them strong, I would help them turn the page, start a new chapter of their lives, and I would, like I did for so many things, I would fix them. I would repair their brokenness. And I was determined that I would succeed at this. And so part of comforting them was I spared them not only my rebellion, but I was at Boston University in the 60s. There was a lot going on, a lot of which would have upset them greatly. And I kept all of that from them. I kept secrets. I kept my life private. And for the most part, I succeeded, although my mother did figure out what those strange plants were in the far corner of one of the fields. But at one point, I was diagnosed with cancer. I couldn't share that. I couldn't tell them. I was involved in the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, every movement. If there was a movement, I was there. And, encountering riot police with German shepherds, they would not have taken well to this information. So I kept a secret. Years later, many years later, I came to learn that my mother also kept a secret. She knew that I could not succeed at fixing them. She knew that and she knew how hard I tried, and she knew I would fail. She knew that their trauma was beyond repair. And so I failed. And you know how you go into these very fancy shop where there are delicate things? There's a sign that says, if you break it, you own it. We've seen those. For me, the expression became, if you can't fix it, you own it. I couldn't fix their trauma, so it became mine. Thank you.
That was really excellent. That was excellent. So I've never met Norm. I've seen Norm on Zoom, but I haven't met him. And I think one of the things that is amazing and special about storytelling is you can listen to somebody speak to you and feel like you know them. Like, that was a great picture of your family, Norm, but really, and also I think the immigrant experience, not just the Holocaust, but about what it's like to come to this country and not have the language and not know the culture. But that was really a portrait of you. That was really great. You handled things very eloquently, just like it was planned. It was really, really well done.